If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, I'm glad to tell you we're back. We got General McGill Alexander, the paratrooper general. We have him back with us. Sir, thank you for your time. I'm really grateful for you. There was a massive amount of comments and likes on your first video. This is the third one. I want to say if there's anything you wish to say to the people who wrote to us and made such nice comments before we carry on with the rest of your distinguished career.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, it was quite a surprise to me to see the comments and the compliments that people gave me. I felt quite humbled by that. But it was particularly encouraging to hear from people who had served under me or who had served with me and who knew me during my military career. Often opinions are passed off by people who never actually knew those people. And many of these people knew me personally. So I'm very grateful for that. And I would like to thank those people who might be watching now who did respond. It was, it's encouraging for me as the person who's doing the speaking. To know that there are people who found it beneficial, found it helpful, found it interesting, and it really makes it worthwhile for me as well. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, sir. It was a fantastic reaction. We're very grateful to all of you. Please keep on commenting. If you have specific questions, just send it to us or make it there. I'm sure the general might find time to answer you. And let's see then what happens further. So now, sir, we are at the stage where you join the permanent force. You're an officer now, you're a lieutenant. I suppose you're a bit older than the rest of the lieutenants. And you made certain goals. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, of course, thank you. I think that it's perhaps beneficial before I actually embark on expanding on those goals to just clarify one or two points from my previous talk. In the first conversation, I spoke about my background, my childhood, my home life, my schooling, my early employment as a civilian, my initial military training, and my qualification as a paratrooper. In the second one, I spent a fair amount of time speaking about the differences between military and civilian parachuting. I also spoke about my citizen force service, my time as a full-time youth worker, and then the growing conflict between my civilian and my military commitments, which ultimately led to me joining the permanent force. There were 3 points that I touched on in my second conversation that have a direct bearing and will have a direct bearing on any subsequent conversations. They affected me very, very genuinely throughout the rest of my career. So I'd like to just elaborate a little bit on those before I get into the actual goals that I set myself. The first is my marriage, and then my children. My wife, Anne, never knew she was marrying a soldier, because at the time that I got married, I was a citizen force soldier. So, I would go away every so often, and she knew that. She knew that it meant a great deal to me, but she sort of viewed it, I think, more as if I had a hobby. Some people have a sport, and it takes them away, but they always come back and they're always still available and they're around. So I don't think it concerned her very much, but she really had no idea what being an army wife would really entail. But fortunately for me, my wife has got a very laid back and relaxed nature. but she's also a person with a great deal of fortitude. As I came to know her during my career, and specifically certain things that took place during my career, she's a woman of great courage. She's uncomplaining. She puts up with a great deal, but she's a resolute person. If Anne makes up her mind that she wants to do something, then she does it. And she doesn't let anything stand in her way. She also is a very independent person. Within her own family, she was the only one who decided she wanted to go overseas. And she saved up enough money while she was working. This is a bit long before I met her. And she went overseas for almost a year, where she spent time working there and traveling around and seeing the world. So she's got pretty much of an independent line and an adventurous spirit. I think she was the only one in her family who actually left home to go and work in another city, not because she was unhappy at home, but just because she wanted some other exposure, more. There was more to see in the world. She's exceptionally resilient. She can adapt to almost anything, and she's innovative. When things are difficult and she's on her own, she comes up with answers. She's a caring person. She's a compassionate person. And she has a tremendous love for little babies and a love of her home. That's what she actually likes. And that's where she likes to be, despite the adventurous spirit that she's got. So when I married her, and as time went on, and after I joined the permanent force particularly, I came to realize that she was always ready to tackle a new adventure with me if I had to go somewhere else and do something else. Our holidays were always spent camping, and she was very, very happy with that. So I think I'd be right to say that I was extremely fortunate in having, if there is such a thing, I had pretty much an ideal army wife. She really adapted very well to the military life. And I know there were many of my compatriots whose wives did not. They found it very, very difficult to adjust to the military and its demands. And then regarding our children, our first child was a little girl with the name of Catherine. She was born with Down syndrome. And she, right from the start, the doctors did not give her a very great chance of surviving because she had a heart defect. And she was in trouble from the day she was born. We had no indication that she was going to be Down syndrome. We discovered after she was born. And she died, as I say, about 9 or 10 days after she was born. Now, this had a profound effect on me, but it had a far greater effect on my wife. And it was a time of great sadness for us. And we could never understand why our first child had to die, had to be born with defects and then had to die. But recently Anne said something to me that really set me thinking. She said, if Catherine had lived, you would never have been able to take the opportunities that you did. And our journey through life would have been very different to the way it was. And, I thought about that, and we discussed it. And we realized that although we might not know, we might not understand why certain things happen, and we question how God can allow certain things in our lives, yet you can see in something like this that somewhere in it, God has got a plan, and it all forms part of his plan. So I think there was a lot of solace for us in that realization, but it did affect us into our life in the military. And then our second daughter was born a little more than a year later. And she was fine. She was absolutely perfect, Melanie. And Melanie was a year old when I joined PF. So when I joined PF, it wasn't as a single young man, footloose and fancy-free, no responsibilities. I joined PF, and I was a young married man with a child. And in fact, my wife was about 5 months pregnant at the time that I joined the PF. So there was another one on the way. So we really we had to look at this change in direction of my life from that particular perspective. Then the second thing that I'd like to say something about is about my citizen force experience. You know, I've done a fair amount of writing, and I've published quite a lot of what I have written. It has been published in articles and magazines and so on, and in a few books, and of course in my research into my master's degree and my doctoral degree. And there are some people who have sometimes leveled accusations at me that I don't understand or I don't appreciate the sacrifices that are made and the difficulties that are encountered by the citizen force, because I'm a PF. So how would I know? They also say that some of them, not everyone, but some of them have said that I never understood the role of the citizen force in the South African Defence Force. Now, I don't want to enter into discussions about that sort of thing, but what I can say is I served as a member of the citizen force for 8 years. 4 of those years as a rifleman and a corporal, and 4 of those years as an officer, a newly commissioned officer. And during that time, I made sacrifices, and I was faced with difficulties that ultimately cost me my civilian job. In the permanent force, I was to work closely, and that will come out in our discussions and subsequent conversations, but I was to work very closely with the citizen force for 6 years at 44 Parachute Brigade. Firstly, as the SO1 operations, which was essentially the chief of staff, and for 3 years, and then another 3 years as the brigade commander. I also worked very closely with the commandos as a group commander, where I had commandos directly under my command, and when I was in Regional Joint Task Force South for a total of 5 years. And during those 5 years, I worked very closely with the commandos, and I employed the commandos. So we'll come to that at a later stage, but that's all I want to say in return. If people feel that I don't know anything about the citizen force, and I don't understand the citizen force, and I don't know how to employ the citizen force or what the purpose of the citizen force or the commandos are, they are welcome to hold those views, but they do also just need to bear in mind some of the facts, because I think some of them are not even aware of those facts. So I thought I need to just clarify that before I move away from my citizen force career. Then the last thing I want to say something about, and I want to say very little about it, is my decision to become a professional soldier. Because a question that is flung at me from time to time in these days is, how could you voluntarily and enthusiastically serve in the army of the apartheid state? Surely that must have seared your conscience. So that's not something I intend answering now. As I relate my story in these conversations, it should become clear to people. And if it doesn't, then, of course, perhaps you can prompt me in the last conversation and remind me that I need to clear that up with people. And then I'll share some thoughts on it. But I really believe that as I continue talking to you and sharing my experiences with you, that should become pretty clear to people. So let's get on with what I'm hoping to share today. And first of all, what is my intention with this particular conversation? I'd like to, in this conversation, to discuss my first decade, my first 10 years as a permanent force officer, because I have often looked back on that decade, those 10 years, with a sense of absolute awe. I feel awe at just how much was actually packed into such a relatively short period. I feel awe at just how many opportunities came my way that I was able to take advantage of. I feel awe particularly at the outstanding people that I was privileged to work with. There were superior officers, there were my peers, and perhaps most importantly, there were my subordinates, those who served under me, the people that I had the honor to command, and it was an honor. Those 10 years was an intense and a very exciting time. It gave me invaluable regimental experience as an officer. You know, the permanent force generally don't have a strong affiliation to a unit because of the fact that the permanent force guys tend to be moved around a lot. So they'll spend time with this unit, and then they get to go to another unit, and then they go to another, few years at each one. They get excellent exposure that way. But they don't develop a really strong bond with a particular unit. There are exceptions, but generally that's the case. Now, there are very real exceptions in terms of some of the units that permanent force people served in. Very few, but there are some very strong exceptions. One of those is 32 Battalion. Now 32 Battalion was like a family. And that's what a regiment really is. It's a family. And many of the guys who served in 32 Battalion, they stayed with 32 Battalion. And they spent their military career in 32 Battalion. And they came in as young second lieutenants. And they stayed there until they were field rank, major, and sometimes even a lieutenant colonel, or as we used to call them, commandants. So a unit like 32 Battalion did have a very strong regimental connotation, much like the citizen force units. Because in the citizen force, most people who serve in the citizen force serve in one unit throughout their citizen force career. And they develop a very strong bond, a very strong association with that unit. And it becomes their regiment. But the permanent force guys, they have a much wider, because of the role that they play as the people who train the national servicemen and the citizen force people, and who have to get other sort of exposure. So they have a far wider sort of view of the military. Whereas the citizen force officer often is his view of the military is what his regiment is. And that's where his loyalty lies, and that's where his interest lies, and that's where his enthusiasm lies. And that's understandable, something we inherited from the British. And I think it's commendable. I think there's a tremendous strength in that. But the permanent force had a different role. And I think sometimes, just as I'm accused of not understanding the citizen force, I think sometimes the citizen force guys don't always understand the role of the permanent force. Anyway, there are other examples. Our special forces are like a family. And once a person qualifies as a special forces operator, the chances are he will stay there for many, many years, and perhaps his whole military career. So within the special forces, there's a strong bond, and the special forces it's their regiment. It's where it's their family, their military family, where they feel they belong. And one of the other exceptions is 1 Parachute Battalion. for whatever reason, there are a lot of people who only spend a few years at one parabon and then they leave. But there are many that I know who arrived at one parachute battalion from the infantry school as a second lieutenant. And they left as a commandant, a lieutenant colonel. They went through their whole regimental career at one parachute battalion. Now, I was very privileged, although I was a bit long in the tooth as a lieutenant when I arrived there. I went on to continue, and I was a senior major by the time I left one parachute battalion. So I served my entire regimental period of my career with one parachute battalion. And I have always regarded it as my regiment. Now, Jannie Geldenhuys, when he was chief of the army, introduced the affiliation system. And it was largely because he saw the value of having this identification with a unit. Unfortunately, the affiliation system didn't quite work out that way, because you had guys who were affiliated to units that they'd never even served in. You had guys who walked around with the badges of units that they didn't even know anything about the unit. So it didn't quite achieve that. But a lot depended on where that officer actually spent his regimental period. And as I say, I was fortunate, like many others, to have mine at one unit, and that was one parachute battalion. So besides the fact that I had a passion for things airborne, I also had a long and an important association with one parachute battalion. And I was affiliated to one parachute battalion under the affiliation system introduced by Jannie Geldenhuys. But I also automatically regarded one parachute battalion as my alma mater. As an ordinary rifleman, I'd served there. As a corporal, I'd served there. When I was first commissioned, I was, even in the citizen force, I was part of one parachute battalion. And when I joined up, I was sent to one parachute battalion. So I went there again. So it's important that one understands that in my case, I had a very strong regimental attachment. And that attachment was with one parachute battalion. And the experience I gained there was invaluable to me. It laid a solid foundation. That first 10 years that I was in the permanent force, it laid a solid foundation for me, for my career, both militarily and academically. Of course, one parachute battalion wasn't responsible for the academic side of it. That was the military academy, which also squeezed into those 10 years. But the truth is that those 10 years laid the foundation for me as a military man and as an academic. So I think you could say that both figuratively and literally, those first 10 years were my baptism of fire. That was when I found myself doing serious soldiering. So that brings me now to my aim and my goals. I wasn't under any illusions when I joined the permanent force. I knew I was a late starter and that my age was against me. I was 28 years old. I was a lieutenant. My peers who were my age were already captains. In some cases, they were already majors. They had all been through the mill, which I had now missed. And I was coming in as a lieutenant, right at the bottom scale of a lieutenant's pay and seniority. And I had to now build myself up. So I was very aware of that, and I had no illusions about it. I knew that I had a lot of catching up to do. I also knew that I would experience resentment from some quarters and even derision, simply because I'd come from the citizen force. I think perhaps I should say something at this point about officer training in in the South African Army specifically, in the Defence Force in general, but specifically in the South African Army at the time that I came in. We're talking about 1974, 75. And the early 70s saw quite a radical change in the training of permanent force officers. Magnus Milan had a great deal to do with this. He was at one stage the officer commanding the military academy. And they introduced a 4-phase system for the training of officers, permanent force officers. Phase 1 was basic military training and skills and so on, which could be anything up to a year. Phase 2 was leadership training. And then officers from all arms of service, Army, Navy, and Air Force, would be sent to the military academy, where they had now military instructors from the 3 different services. And those instructors were carefully selected, and they were highly competent, very professional people. And the officers who went there spent 6 months doing phase 2. And during those 6 months, they were given formative officer training. And the focus was on officership. Thinking of leadership was taught to them. They did other things as well. There was some exposure to military history and to military geography and political science, but it was very superficial. The focus was on training these guys to be real leaders and to understand what their role was as officers. And as I say, it was Army, Navy, and Air Force mixed up doing all of this. Then came phase 3, and phase 3 was optional. Not everybody did it. And in fact, not everybody qualified to do it. And phase 3 was the academic training. Then you remained at the military academy and you did your Bachelor of Military Science degree. People were selected. They had to have the right matric to be able to do that. They also needed to want to do that. And there were some who didn't want to do that. They wanted to get straight on with the soldiering. They didn't want to sit in a classroom now. So many guys who could have gone to the academy opted not to. Others were not selected, and others did not have the academic qualification to grant them access to the academy. So they continued as officers, but they went straight into phase 4. Now, phase 3, the academic training, did go through a controversial period, a time of great questioning, because in order to fit all of this in, the 3-year degree course through the University of Stellenbosch at their Faculty of Military Science, which was housed in the military academy, that 3-year course was concertinaed, was compacted and contracted into so that it could fit into 2 years. So those guys who did phase 3 did their degree course in 2 years, not in 3 years. And the way they managed to do this was they did away with the long recess periods. So what it boiled down to was you could finish your first year on Friday, and then you started your second year on Monday. There was no break. Now, the academics at the military academy and the lecturers were academics who'd been put into uniform. They were not really military people, although they wore military uniform, but their qualification was an academic qualification. And they were part of this, they were recognized as such by the University of Stellenbosch. They had to be in order to lecture in the faculty. And those academics tended to question this seriously. The feeling was that when you've done a year of academic study, there needs to be a break so that your brain can rest from absorbing facts, and it can process the facts that it has absorbed. And then after this sort of period of rest, of a break, then you get on to the next academic year. But these guys were not being given that opportunity. They were being hammered to get finished as quickly as possible. And it was tough. I wouldn't like to have had to do a 3-year degree in 2 years. particularly an undergraduate degree, because you're learning how to function. Your brain's learning how to function at the tertiary level and the tertiary academic level. And Stellenbosch University had a very, very high standard. So you had to come up to scratch. And a lot of guys fell off during that phase 3. And then they had to join their buddies on phase 4. Phase 4 was then a year spent visiting core schools for the Army. The Air Force and the Navy had their own particular version of phase 4. But for the Army, you went to different corps. You went to the infantry school, you went to the School of Armor, you went to the School of Engineers, you went to the logistics, the personnel, the signals, the School of Artillery, all of these core schools. This group of young candidate officers went along to those places. And they did little courses and they qualified, and they, essential things like becoming a platoon commander. They all had to do platoon commander's course, regardless of which corps they were. So they were all trained infantrymen, besides later going to the armor or the artillery or the logistics or whatever. They all had to go and do a driving and maintenance course. These basic sort of things had to all get fitted into this final year, this phase 4. So what you had was, you had these guys who had, in many cases, they went through most of those 4 years as a candidate officer or a midshipman, and they were only commissioned at the end or towards the end of it. So you had these exceptionally well-trained officers who are now sporting their rank on their shoulders, but they've been through an officer training course of essentially 4 years. And there were not many countries in the world that gave that much attention to the training of officers. I used to keep an eye on, when I was in the citizen force, I kept an eye on what was going on in the permanent force, because I was always interested in that. And I had the greatest respect for those officers who went through that 4-year phase 1 to 4 training. They must really have been exceptionally well trained, and they were. They turned into. They made a great success of their lives afterwards, because they got such a solid grounding. So it's not surprising that there was a degree of resentment when I joined up. I hadn't been through that. And the guys would ask me questions. They'd say, so what training did you have to do before you were accepted in the citizen force, in the permanent force? And I'd have to say to them, well, I didn't do any training. My citizen force qualification was acceptable. Now, my citizen force training had been, I think, 2 courses each of 3 weeks at the infantry school, compared to a guy who's done 4 years. I suppose you could say I'd done the equivalent of phase 1, but I certainly hadn't done phase 2. I hadn't done phase 3. I hadn't done phase 4. And they said to me, so was it because you've got a degree? I didn't have a degree. So what do I have? And I could see the skepticism in their faces. And this was something that I had to deal with as I came into the military, and I had to come to terms with that. And I knew it was there. I knew it was going to come, and I had no illusions about that at all. But when I joined the permanent force late in 1975, given that sort of background, my aim was very simple. My aim was to master my profession as an officer of paratroopers. That's it. I wanted to master my profession as an officer of paratroopers. And that sounds very simple. That entailed a heck of a lot of work. a heck of a lot of worse, because an officer of paratroopers is a highly qualified person, and I had to now start qualifying myself. I understood that to achieve this aim would entail equipping myself with the knowledge, the skills, and the experience that the paratrooper officer needed. But I also realized that even if I managed to acquire those, they would mean nothing without me gaining the confidence of my subordinates through my application of those skills. It doesn't help to have the skills. It doesn't help to have a certificate hanging on your wall if you don't have the ability to apply what you've been taught, what you're now qualified in, to apply it to what you're doing. And I realized this. I had no doubt about that at all. I knew that it was going to require from me very wise and very understanding leadership. And I would have to draw on the experience that I'd built up in the South African Exploration Society, in running camps with young people, and in my dealings with principals and other people. I would have to draw on that because I didn't have anything else to draw on. I would have to draw on what I'd been taught at the high school for boys, Potchefstroom, because I didn't have anything else to draw on. I'd have to draw on my experience as a trainer of guide dogs and blind people. Now, all of that helped, but it wasn't specific to the military situation. Did I achieve my aim? To what extent I did is not for me to say. That must be left for comment by those who served under my command. They would be able to say whether I achieved the mastering of my profession as an officer of paratroopers. Now, in achieving this aim, I formulated 5 goals. The first goal was to lead paratroopers in battle. Unless I did that, how was I going to gain the confidence of both my subordinates and my superiors, and for that matter, my peers? One must understand that at the time that I joined up in the permanent force, Operation Saldanha was coming to a close. Even those who were junior to me, the second lieutenants in one parachute battalion, had experience in combat. Some of them were decorated with the honoris crux. They were people who had been there. They'd done that. I hadn't. So this became a goal. I had to lead paratroopers in battle. Otherwise, I've never proved myself as an officer of paratroopers. I've never proved myself if I've never done that. And that's what I had to strive to do. Now, fortunately, the war was, I don't say it's fortunate that any war must hot up, but the war was hotting up. Unfortunately for my attempts to achieve that particular goal, the chances of me being involved in combat with one parachute battalion, because of one parachute battalion's growing involvement in the war, were quite high. The second goal I had was to exercise command, formally be appointed in positions of command. I hadn't yet had that in the military. I'd served as a company 2IC in the citizen force. I'd served briefly as a platoon commander on camps. I'd served as an adjutant, but I hadn't really had proper command. And I wanted command, and I tried to be very realistic about things. I wanted to command through the various levels, up to and including the level of brigade. And I think what helped me to formulate that particular goal was the months that I spent at the headquarters of 71 Brigade at the castle in Cape Town. And there I was under the mentorship and guidance of Henry Kempen, the Second World War veteran, who had also been in the Rhodesian Army, a wise man, a competent man, and a man who exercised a lot of patience with me and spent a great deal of time telling me about how a brigade functions. And I was enthralled. I was enthralled with the whole concept of integrating artillery and armor and infantry into a unit that could move forward. He was the first one who sat down and explained to me what a combat team is and what a battle group is, and how they can function independently, but what role the brigade has to ultimately play when you put them all together and you have to logistically support them. So I was very grateful for that, and I was absolutely taken by it. And I dreamed that one day there might be a parachute brigade or even a division. That was a bit unrealistic, but not the brigade side of it. Little did I know that within a few years there would be a parachute brigade. But I wanted to command to, I knew at that stage, I thought it can't be a parachute brigade, but at least if I can get to commanding a brigade, that would be a fine way, to a fine aim or objective or goal, something to strive towards as in my military career. And then I really wanted to work as a third goal. I wanted to work with soldiers from other nations. I'd read extensively, and particularly about the Second World War and how the Allies operated together. And I longed to be able to work with other countries like that. I read extensively on NATO and how NATO functioned. And I used to get journals and magazines on a regular basis, or I'd find them in libraries, and I'd read about exercises that NATO carried out. And I thought to myself that I really would like to be able to do that. There wasn't much chance of it in South Africa at that stage, because we didn't have much to do with other countries because of sanctions and boycotts and so on. But I really believe that things are going to change. They can't go on like this. There's got to be change in the country. And when that change does come, maybe we'll have greater acceptance in the world, and perhaps I'll be able to deploy with the United Nations or something along those lines. So that's something that I really held as a goal. I would like to work with soldiers from other nations and see how other nations manage to run their military and what the differences are and how these things are done in other parts of the world. I had another goal that I felt would be a good way to conclude my military service one day when I came to the end of it. And that was to become a military attaché. I always wanted to see the world. I always wanted to travel. And I really longed to live in another country just so that I could be exposed to a different culture and other people and a different way of doing things. And I thought that being a military attaché would give me that sort of opportunity. So I felt that's something I would like to aspire to. It's not that important at this stage of my life, but ultimately, and they say that in the military you have two types of appointments, depending on your age and your ambition. One is when you're appointed as a stepping stone. You take that appointment to get to the next appointment. Something I've always had a problem with, because people who use appointments as stepping stones never really have a passion for the job that they're doing. They're looking at the next job already. But the other one, that's the stepping stone. But the other type of appointment is the gravestone. And the gravestone is when you reach that level in your life where you're not going any further and you're nearing retirement now. Now they give you an appointment that will keep you happy until your retirement arrives. And I thought to myself, that'd be nice to then, if I've got all the experience and the background, to become a military attaché, and then I can retire peacefully, believing that I've achieved what I wanted to do. So that leaves just one other goal behind, and it was a goal which I felt I do need to put down, because ultimately, what am I trying to do? Ultimately, in the military, you're always talking about rank. So what sort of rank am I aspiring to? Do I want to become Chief of the Defense Force? No, I didn't. Do I want to become Chief of the Army? No, I didn't. There were many people I knew that's definitely what they wanted to do. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I never aspired towards that sort of thing. I said to myself when I joined up, if I can reach the rank of colonel, I'll be happy. I'll feel I've had a good career if I can become a colonel. That's a good rank. It's an influential rank, and there are wonderful positions available for the rank of colonel. So that's what I felt I would aspire towards. When I joined up, I knew that I was part of a minority. I was English speaking. Probably between 80 and 90% of the officers in the South African Army were Afrikaans speaking. So I was very much part of a minority. And that was apparent to me throughout my career. Every course I went on, there were only a little handful of Engelsmannen. The rest were Afrikaans. For a long period, when I was at 1 Parachute Battalion, in our total permanent force complement, there were only 2 English-speaking officers. I was one of them, and my company 2IC was the other one. So our company was inevitably known as Die Engelse Company. But I knew when I went in the military, I knew that was going to be the case. It didn't worry me, because I didn't formulate impossible goals where I would have to fight to try and gain those sort of positions. I always found that Afrikaans predominated in the army. Most lectures in almost every course were in Afrikaans. The instructors would invariably make funny little jokes, which I didn't really find funny at all, about we're going to we'll use 50% English and 50% Afrikaans. I'll speak Afrikaans, and any of you who want to speak English can do so. And little things like that. But that didn't concern me. The fact that most of my handbooks were in Afrikaans, often my exams were written in Afrikaans. They didn't have to be. I was free to write them in English, but I was comfortable in Afrikaans. So it really didn't concern me. I was not in the military to wage a crusade for language rights. I was in the military to be a soldier, and I wanted my soldiering sorted out. I wanted to become a professional master of my profession. And if I had to do that in Afrikaans, no problem to me, I would do it. So I never felt threatened by Afrikaans. I never felt intimidated by it. I never felt discriminated against. There were 1 or 2 instances of discrimination because I was English speaking, but none of them really bothered me, and they were the absolute exception. I was very comfortable, and on the whole, I found that the Afrikaans speaking guys had no problem with me as an English speaker, and I was very grateful for that. I think it was a mature way of approaching things, and I appreciated them for doing it in that way. So that was my 5 goals that I had. When we get to the final conversation we do in this series, then I'd like to return to those goals, and we can perhaps discuss whether or not I achieved those goals and to what extent I did so within my military career. I had other secondary goals of lesser importance. Not all of them were specifically military in nature. And I also knew that my chances of achieving them were not very good, not particularly because they were unrealistic, but because of my age and because of the amount of catching up I had to do. There were many courses that I had to do. They were essential for my promotion. And they would have to enjoy priority over my hopes and my dreams. Time wasn't on my side, and I had to live with that. So I hoped I'd be able to do those things, but I never, it wasn't going to worry me terribly if I didn't. I hoped to qualify as a tactical freefaller and as a pathfinder. I hoped to become a parachute instructor. I hoped to earn a university degree. I'd been studying for several years through UNISA in an effort to try and get a degree. I found it extremely difficult because if you put everything into your work during the day, you're exhausted in the evening, and then to sit down and work. So I tried to reverse things, and I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and work on my studies. And then halfway through the day, I'd be exhausted. I wouldn't be able to do my work that I'm being paid for properly. So, I did get a couple of credits and learned a little bit about what tertiary education is about, but I wasn't going to easily get that degree. So, and I knew that. So I said, I would still like to get a degree. And if I get the opportunity, I even if I have to do night classes or something, but we'll see if I can get around to a university degree. I also said I'd like to do a special forces course. I'd like to qualify as a special forces operator. But really, my interest doesn't lie in small teamwork. My interest lies in deploying a sizable airborne force to carry out a significant operation on the ground. I want to work with companies and higher, up to brigades. I don't want to work with 4 or 5 man teams. That's not really my interest. I don't decry that because there's a tremendous role for special forces, but you have to have a dedication, a passion for that to do special forces work. And that wasn't my passion. So I would like to have done it, but I knew there's not really time for this now. If I'd been a younger man, I could maybe have done it. And if I'd qualified as a special forces operator, I could have spent some time doing it. And then I could have moved on to something else. But I knew there's not really time for this. So it's a dream, but it's probably a pipe dream. I also had a desire to learn a foreign language. I just thought that for my own good, for my own betterment as a person, it would be good to learn a foreign language. But what's the chances of doing it? I've got to work so hard now to prove myself in the military. And then I hope to possibly one day study at a foreign military institute. I'd read about people who had done the Joint Staff Course level training, gone overseas, and how the Brits and the Americans exchanged people at that high level and so on. And I thought to myself, it would really be good to go to a foreign institute and see how things are done there. But again, I thought there's no time for that sort of thing. I've got to play catch up now. That's what I've got to do. I hope to travel abroad. I so much wanted to see the world, but again, I thought to myself, you've got a responsibility now, a responsibility not only to your family, but a responsibility to the soldiers that you're going to be working with. So you can't sit and have pipe dreams about these things. You've got to focus on what you're doing, and that's what you've got to do. So whatever I had to do, I had to now think about these things and work out where do my priorities lie as I move into this. So let's move on to the decade of action, the regimental grounding that I got and the serious soldiering that I did. It didn't really start off very well. I left Cape Town for Bloemfontein. I was appointed as an officer instructor at 1 Parachute Battalion. I reported to the OC of 1 Paraben, who was Commandant Ewald Olkers. In my interview with him, when I arrived at the unit and I saluted and stood before him in his office, I said to him, because I'd been wearing a beard for some time, and I'd managed to, although initially in a citizen force, I had to shave it off every time I went on a camp. In later years, when I became a lieutenant, I found that the citizen force was relaxing the regulations on wearing beards, and I started wearing my beard for parades and camps, and it was accepted. It wasn't considered a problem. So I arrived at 1 Paraben with a beard in the permanent force now, and I appeared before Ewald Olkers. And I said to him, Commandant, ek het een versoek, maar ek verstaan as hy dit nie wil vir my gee nie. Mag ek asseblief my baard hou? And Ewald Olkers looked at me and he laughed, and he said, he used to always call me Alexis. He said, Alexis, my maat, as ek 'n baard kon dra, sou ek dit dra. Hou jou baard, dis nie 'n probleem nie. Yeah, I didn't expect that, but I was thrilled. So I went off, and he appointed me as the 2IC of A Company, and my company commander was Andre Bespier, Major Andre Bespier, the younger brother of Frank Bespier, who had been my company commander in B Company when I was a soldier. The battalion's 2IC looked at me with very jaundiced eyes when he found out that I had been given permission to wear my beard. And he was none other than the man who'd been my platoon commander when I was a young soldier, Major Archie Moore. And Archie Moore had just returned from 2 years attachment to the Rhodesian Army and been appointed as the 2IC of 1 Paraben. He wasn't antagonistic towards me at that stage, but he didn't like the fact that I was bucking the system by wearing a beard, and that I'd managed to persuade the commandant to give me permission to wear that. I stayed in the OFS Command Officers Mess. We didn't have anywhere to live at that stage. I'd left Anne behind in Cape Town. She packed up our stuff, and she and Melanie, our little 1-year-old daughter, then got on a train and traveled up to Bloemfontein and joined me in the mess. I'd applied for a house, and I'd been given the assurance that a military accommodation would be made available to me. At that stage, Anne was 5 months pregnant, so she had to pack up on her own. It was the first of many, many, many times where she had to pack up on her own when I wasn't there. And she traveled up alone in the train with Melanie and joined me in the mess. It was not a great mess in those days. It was really in quite a poor state, but we waited for our furniture to arrive, and it had to go into storage when it did arrive. But eventually I was given a maisonette in the town. It was hired by the Department of I don't know, Public Works or something. So it was made available to the military, and we moved in there. And we had military neighbors. One of them was Lucas Grindling, who was a captain at the battalion, and I got to know him quite well. My wife Anne became very friendly with his wife Anniki, and I had great respect for him. He was an outstanding man. Sadly, 2 years later, he was killed he was drowned in a parachute accident, which was very, very sad. Great potential that he had. I found myself there in Bloemfontein in a very tight-knit and closed community. 1 Paraben was like that. And I was very aware that I was now an interloper. I'd come from the outside, although I'd been a soldier in one paraben and all the rest of it. But now I'd come from the citizen force, from 2 paraben, and now I was imposing myself on these paratroopers. I helped with the presenting of basic training while I was with A Company. And then Archie Moore seemed to take a bit of a fancy to me, and he said, you know, we've got to start sending you on courses, and we've got to start getting you qualified. First thing I want to do is I want to send you on a dispatcher's course here in the battalion, so that we can utilize you more effectively while you're in the battalion. So I found myself on a dispatcher's course 8 years after I'd done my basic parachute course. It was extremely interesting. My instructor was again the same man who trained me for my basic parachute course, Frans van Zyl. And what an outstanding instructor he was. And so I did my dispatcher's course. Then our little family had another tragedy. I was out in the veld training with the troops, and Anne suffered a ruptured uterus. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was rushed to hospital, and she came very, very close to dying. And I was called back from the veld where I was out at the Brug. And by the time I got to the hospital, the baby had been born, well premature. And my wife was in ICU. And they warned me that there's a strong chance that both of them will die. So it was a very unfortunate situation to be in, particularly at a time when we were just adjusting to living in this new area, in this new place, new home that we just moved into. We joined the local church, and the minister looked after Melanie for us during this time. Anne survived miraculously, and I'm grateful to God for that. But our little girl, Yvonne, only lived for 2 days, and she died. Her lungs were underdeveloped, and in those days they apparently couldn't do much about it. So she died. So for a second time, I found myself carrying a small white coffin to the grave. The difference between that time and the first time was the first time Anne was with me. This time Anne was in hospital, and I was on my own carrying this little coffin to the grave. And that was heart-sore. It again affected us very strongly. And I have little doubt that those experiences early in our married life led to us ultimately becoming involved in caring for abandoned and neglected and abused babies in our retirement. I'm sure it had played a very definite role, because whenever I see a small baby, I think of my 2 little girls who died when they were babies. I cannot do anything else. I think of that, and I was never able to hold them and cuddle them and look after them. They were gone. I had to bury them. That was sad. It's nowhere near as bad as losing an older child or a grown-up child. That must really be terrible. And I acknowledge that what we went through is nowhere near as difficult as that. But it did tear at our hearts. We did feel it very, very strongly, and myself. Then one day, we were busy on the parade ground, and the adjutant came through to us and said an urgent signal has come from Pretoria. The officer training has been changed, and the 4-phase system that was implemented that included phase 2 and phase 3 at the academy, that's all come to an end now. And now they're sending, each arm of service will in future train their own officers independently, not have to go together in a sort of a combined a joint type of officers course. And the military academy's controversial 2-year period of academic training will now revert back to the old 3-year period. But because of this change that has taken place, they now have a problem in terms of first-year students for this year's military academy. They don't have people available to do that. And they don't want to not run a first-year course at the academy. So now they're desperately looking for officers who are already commissioned, who would be prepared to go to the military academy and do the 3-year degree course. And they want to know who would be prepared to appear before a selection board for this. I was faced with a bit of a dilemma, and they wanted to know immediately. The adjutant was there on the parade ground. Are you interested or not? Speaking to all the permanent force, the junior officers. They're prepared to take people even if you're married, which had never happened at the academy before. I mean, they were all young, unmarried officers. So I said, yes, I'm interested. But I had to go and discuss it with Anne. I mean, I tell them now I'm interested. I can always cancel at a later stage, but this is a huge issue. In fact, every reason for me not going was apparent. Anne had just lost the baby. She was still trying to recover from her ordeal. But she was very happy in Bloemfontein. And we had a very nice place in Bloemfontein that we were living in. And she really didn't want to have to move again now, after just a few months. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, you know, I'm so far behind with courses. If I go to the military academy now, I'm going to lose another 3 years. To catch up is going to, it's really, but this is an opportunity to study at state expense and to get the degree that I want. What should I do? And I didn't quite know what to do. And I was walking up through the lines of one Parachute Battalion the next day. And I passed the company officers of Charlie Company, C Company. And the company commander came out of the door. And I greeted him and saluted him. And his name was Captain Chris Leroux, who would later become, I think, the longest serving OC of one Parabon. But Chris Leroux called me over and he said, McGill, ek hoor jy wil akademie toe gaan. So I said, ja, kaptein, ek wil, maar ek weet nie of dit die regte besluit is nie. Ek is klaar so ver agter, ek het so baie om in te haal. Ek dink miskien moet ek dit heroorweeg. Ek moet maar probeer om my graad deeltyds te kry. And Chris Leroux looked at me and he said, McGill, die besluit is jou nou. Maar as jy my opinie wil vra, he was a graduate of the academy. He said, as jy my opinie wil weet, dan sê ek jy moet gaan. Dit is belangrik om 'n graad te kry. Dit gaan niks beteken vir jou loopbaan nie, maar dit gaan baie beteken vir jou. And I said, ja, maar, and he said, jy sal, daai ander goed sal jy inhaal. Jy sal dit nog inhaal. Maar wie weet of jy weer 'n kans gaan kry om 'n graad te kry. Dis maar my beskeie opinie. You take it or leave it. So I'm not telling you you must. I understand you've got other things to consider. But if I was in your shoes, I'd take this opportunity and go and get my degree at the academy. Yeah, so I thought about it again. And he'd also been involved in the training of the military training of the officers at the military academy. In fact, while he was there, he got his honors degree at the academy. So he was directly involved in the phase 2 training as an instructor. And I thought to myself that, that if that's what he says, I value his opinion. And maybe that's what I should do. And fortunately, I stuck to that. 4 of us from one parachute battalion applied, 4 young lieutenants. It was myself, it was Leon Groenewald, it was David Blow, and it was Fanny van Skalkwyk, the quartermaster. And when Archie Moore heard about this, he just about blew his top, because it was, for a battalion just to lose 4 young lieutenants just like that, and particularly as the war was busy hotting up. And I had to think to myself too, if I go to the academy now, I'm not going to be deployed operationally. I'm going to be even further behind my peers who are being deployed on a regular basis at this stage. What shall I do? But to get a degree is something important to me, and it's going to have lasting effect for me. And it's a military degree, not just an ordinary civilian degree. So I applied. Archie Moore went to see Ewald Olkers about it and complain about all these guys going off. And Archie Moore made sure, first of all, that both Leon Groenewald and Fanny van Skalkwyk, the quartermaster, they were withdrawn immediately. They were told, you cannot go. The unit cannot spare you. You're not going. I went up to Pretoria to appear before the selection board, and David Blow was on his military law course up in Pretoria. And when I was waiting to appear before the selection board, David Blow appeared there with me as well. And he was waiting to be called in. And a message came through and said, there's a message come from one parachute battalion. They've withdrawn you. You may not go to the military academy. So David Blow had to say no as well. So in the end, I was the Johnny-come-lately. I was the last one of the 4 to have arrived at one parabon. So it was, last in, first out. And they said, all right, it won't look good if one parachute battalion doesn't let anybody go to the military academy. But we'll let Alexander go because he's got no experience and he's no great loss. So I found myself going down to the military academy. The selection board was happy with me. And we moved to Saldanha. That was an ordeal because the situation at the military academy was extremely difficult. They were looking for students and they were prepared to take married students and students who were already commissioned officers. But they did not have accommodation for them. So they said to us, we can accept you, but you've got to find your own accommodation. And there is no military accommodation available. We cannot offer you a house or anything else. You'll have to pay out of your own pocket. Now, that was a problem to me too, because when I joined permanent force, I took a cut in pay from what I had been earning in my civilian job. So we had to make an adjustment. I took a cut in pay. When I went to the academy, I lost all my allowances. I used to get a parachute allowance. I used to get, I forget what it's called in English, an ontberingstoelaag, a discomfort allowance. I used to get a service allowance. There were all sorts of extra allowances that you got as an operational officer that I now lost. So my salary was shrinking all the way down. And now they tell me, well, you've got to find accommodation yourself. And I looked at possibly if I could borrow or hire a caravan somewhere and we could go and live in the caravan park in Saldanha, maybe that would be a solution. The OC at the military academy was an Air Force brigadier, Jan van Lochrenberg. He later became chief of the Air Force. But what an incredible gentleman he was. And what a wise commander he was. And he called us in. We were not a big group. We were only 23, 24, somewhere around there. And I think we were about 5 or 6 of us were married. And he eventually called us in and he said, look, we've got to find a solution to this. I know you people can't afford to hire a place in Saldanha, but I'll tell you what I'm prepared to do. Behind the academy, the first years and previously the phase 2 students were housed in old Second World War barrack rooms up on Malgaskop, which was behind the academy, overlooking the bay. He said, we've got no first-year students other than you people. All those barrack rooms up there are empty. I'm prepared to give each family a barrack room, and they're divided into smaller rooms. You'll have to have a communal bathroom, and you'll have to pay what is allowed for potluck accommodation, which was very little that we'd have to pay for it. He said, it's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be easy, but it's the best I can offer you. So we all grabbed it. He said, that's fine. We'll make it as comfortable as we can. And we did. I was perhaps fortunate. I got the bungalow, the barrack room, right at the bottom of this row of bungalows on the hillside, with nothing in front of me, just a place to turn cars around and drive back up, looking out across the bay, the most magnificent view. And we ended up living in that place for 2 years. It was primitive. There was no water in the bungalow at all. But there was another bungalow a little further away that had a shower in the far end, a bathroom with showers and basins in. And there was an outside toilet near to it, about 30 meters away from us. So those were our ablution facilities, and we had to share those. So we worked out a timetable, and each family could go to the bathroom. They had a block time to go to the bathroom and do what they needed to do, and so on. And as I say, the facilities were old, they were dilapidated, they really weren't in great shape, and they were primitive. I drilled holes in the wooden walls, and I got hose pipes, and I connected them to the showers because there were a whole bank of showers there. We only needed a few of them. So I connected one of these to the showers with a hose pipe, and I brought the hose pipe through the drains and throw on under the pathway, and through the hole I drilled in the wall, and I connected a tap to it. And Anne would turn that on, and when she'd filled 2 buckets, then the hot water would start coming, because I left it on the hot water tap. I connected it to the hot water tap. So after two buckets full, the hot water would come. Then she'd use those 2 buckets to water our little garden that we made outside. Eventually, I bought a chemical toilet, a camping toilet, that I put in our bedroom so that Anne wouldn't have to go out in the freezing cold, in the mist. And she had bronchitis every winter. She was terribly sick. In fact, the doctor said to her, if you don't watch out, you're not going to make it through another winter. She never complained. She settled in, made the best of it. Everyone we had, I think there were 5 little rooms in our barrack room and our bungalow, all looking out on this little wooden balcony out onto the bay. But each one opened onto the balcony. So there were no interleading doors. So we used one as a kitchen, and then you'd go out on the balcony, and the next one was as our little lounge and living room, and the next one was our bedroom, and the next one was my study, and so we had. That's the way it worked. I eventually even got an old bath that I set up in our bedroom, and got a tea joint for the hose pipe so that I could get hot water to the bath, so that Anne didn't have to walk over to the shower in the next bungalow to be able to go to the loo. So we all managed to make it work. But we were very grateful to Jan van Logerenberg for making that arrangement. Of course, the setup was very disruptive for the academy. You know, the academy had built up over the years, 20 years or so that it existed, had built up traditions of its own. And now we came and really threw all those traditions out, because to start with, we weren't KOs, we weren't candidate officers, we were officers. In fact, there were 3 of our number who were actually captains. Some of us were lieutenants, and a few of them were second lieutenants. And in the past, they'd all been candidate officers. And they had a system of families at the academy, where the third year guy was the grandfather, and the second year guy was the father, and the first year guy was the son. And they had this lineage of families that came together. And every time the new guys would come, then in the first year, then the second years would go and find someone and say, right, you're my son. And that over there, that's your grandfather, that's my father. And they would sort of help you through and look after you as you were going. But now these guys are all juniors in terms of years and rank to us. And we're now first years, and they've got to become our fathers. But in any case, it would be impossible, because of course, just ahead of us, the guys who were in second year while we were in first year, I think there were about 120 of them. And we were only just over 20. So there was no way that there could be proper families and so on. It messed up a lot of, and there were a lot of other traditions that they used to, you know, there was never that I knew of any bad hazing, ontgroening that took place at the academy, but there were certain traditions that took place, and now they couldn't really take place. And the senior guys, we weren't really in the mood for studentenpret. We wanted to get on with actually doing the work, and I'm sure you will identify with that, because you went to university at a more advanced stage, and you had to put up with the nonsense of the first years and the immaturity and the priorities that they had, when what you were there to study. That's what you were, and that's what we were there for. And so, but our group was disparate. We had older guys and we had younger guys. It was a very mixed up sort of situation, but it was an opportunity. So that's what I really wanted to do. We had no naval students. We only had Air Force and Army. For some reason, the Navy, they didn't want to get involved in that particular setup at that stage. Before us and after us, there were naval students again, but that particular year, there just weren't any naval students. As I say, we were about 22 guys on the course that started. During the course of the 3 years, we lost 5 of them. Due to their academic achievements not being up to scratch. And we gained another 1 who had failed something a year or 2 ahead, and they allowed him to stay and graduate with us instead of with his actual course. So in the end, when we graduated, we were only 18 people. It was a very, very small course. It was problematic that we were wearing rank. Some of the lecturers were only captains, and now some of the students are also captains. So to make this thing work within the military context that the academy was striving to achieve was very difficult. But I think they found that the hard work of most of the students who came in our group was appreciated, because the guys were really focusing on that. I've already mentioned the remuneration. We all lost our allowances, so we were all a bit short of cash. And although we didn't pay tuition fees, so that was a tremendous advantage, and we had this accommodation and so on, we still had to buy our textbooks. And as you will know, university textbooks are phenomenally expensive. And that used to put a huge dent at the beginning of every year in our budget. So, you know, there were many times that Anne and I, by the time we got halfway through the month, our diet was basically pop and wors, and pop and sauce. That's what we could eat. That's what we could afford. So it was tough. My wife never complained. She never had a problem. If she did, she kept it to herself. She supported me, she encouraged me. Of course, we had a problem with the relationship with the other students, particularly in the beginning, because those guys who are now in second year, they'd really been looking forward to having first years that they could shunt around a bit. And now these first years come along and they're more senior in rank than what they are, and they're not going to allow these guys to shunt them around. So it was problematic. It took us a while to sort that out. So by the time they got to third year and we were in our second year, it had been reasonably sorted out. And you know, whereas there were a few clashes earlier on, we'd learned to live with one another and to tolerate one another and to make it work in a better way. My approach to my studies was a very concerted one. I wanted to make the best of this opportunity. I already had a credit from UNISA in history, but the Stellenbosch wouldn't recognize it for the BMIL. I had to do a first year military history course. So I had that extra credit, but it wasn't of any value to me. But I took extra subjects. You know, I took extra subjects in my second and in my third year. In fact, I graduated with 3 majors and not just 2. My majors were military history, military geography, and political science. And the other courses that I did first and second year, I did public administration, military law, mercantile law. Those were all extra things that will form part of the degree, but that I never took them as majors. I didn't get involved much in the Studenta Cascanadas. It was I didn't feel I had time for that. Besides the fact that I had extra subjects which required extra hard work from me, I used my weekends to work. The unmarried students down to Stellenbosch or Cape Town, they were looking for the girls, because of course I think it was in our second year, 77. The first 3 girls that had ever come to the academy began to study there. So we did have girls before we left, but the fact of the matter is that when we were there to start with, they weren't girls, and a lot of the guys had girlfriends elsewhere in other parts of the Western Cape and so on. So weekends the academy would empty. But I sat in the sun on the balcony looking out over the sea with my drawing board, doing my geography or whatever it was, and working. I worked every weekend, long periods. During the week when I was at lectures, whenever I had a free period, I would spend it in the library. And I used the opportunity that I then had to do a deeper study of airborne operations. I tried my best at every opportunity. I tried to pull them into the tasks that I had to do. You know, if I had to do a task on weather for meteorology in geography, then I would make the task the influence of weather on airborne operations. So you know, I was always looking at a way to try and expand and deepen my knowledge of airborne operations. I also started writing a great deal. Soon after I arrived at the academy, the Paratus magazine was advertising a military essay competition, and I decided to enter that. And I wrote an article called "The Value of Advanced Education for the modern officer. And I did quite a bit of research, and I wrote this article. I knew it wouldn't help for me to write an airborne type of thing, because if you want to win this competition, and I desperately did, because the winning prize was 100 Rand, which was a massive amount in 1976. So I selected a topic which I thought would have a far broader appeal. And it did, and I won. And, you know, I was called up in front of the whole academy in the hall, and the officer commanding shook my hand and presented me with a check and so on. My wife was thrilled. We could eat a good meal. It was really great. And I realized, you know, perhaps I can make a little bit of money doing this. So I started writing articles on airborne aspects and sending them to magazines to try and solicit a publication. And quite a few were published, and I did get paid for them. I wrote a whole series on different aspects of airborne operations. And I was remunerated for that. So that was very useful, not just from the point of view of making a bit of extra money to survive on. It compelled me to do further research into the topic that I was really interested in. It doesn't mean that I had no student life at the academy. There were leisure and sport aspects. We had a sports parade every Wednesday afternoon, and myself and the guy who became my closest friend in the academy, an Air Force pilot by the name of Gary Barron, he was a captain. Gary and I would go down to the naval base for sports parade, and we'd go sailing. We'd take out a little boat, and we'd go sailing on the bay. Neither of us was much good at it, but it was a good way to get a bit of a break. The academy insisted that we do equitation. I think there was still a feeling in those days that a good officer must know how to ride a horse. So we used to go down to the stables and have lessons in equitation. I didn't shape very well in that, I have to confess. I never was a good horseman. They had an annual competition, a rowing competition called the Silva, and using whalers from the naval base, from SAS Saldanha. And then we would have to row. Each of the 3 year groups would have to have a rowing team, and then the staff had a rowing team. And they restricted the number of naval guys to 3 in the team, because the naval guys all knew how to row. So if you filled your whole boat with naval guys, you'd easily win the rowing race. But we didn't have any naval guys. And the first time we ever climbed into a whaler was the first competition that we had. And everything was done on a sort of eeny, meeny, miny, mo basis. And I was the mo who was appointed as the coxswain. So I had to control this boat and urge the guys on and so on. Of course, we lost. I mean, we didn't get anywhere with that sort of thing. But it was good sport. It was good relaxation. It was good leisure time activities. The academy was also involved in what they call trapkar, a type of pedal car that had to be designed and built by universities or faculties within the universities. And then there were competitions, inter-university competitions with this trapkar. And it looked like you were almost lying on your back on these things with the pedals that you had to turn. Then it had a bicycle chain and cogs attached and these little wheels. And the guys would pick up quite a speed with these trapkar. And I used to participate in trapkar as well. That was something else. Cross-country was very popular at the academy. And I did cross-country. I went on cross-country runs, and I used to walk in the hills behind us and through over the rocks and through the little bays and beaches and so on. A beautiful area, that military area that at the academy. So it was a joy to me. If I really felt that I needed a break, then I'd go on a long run all the way around the koppies and then back up to the top of Malgaskop. Our military history class used to go on excursions. We went to the castle in Cape Town and the Naval Museum and to Simonstown and various other places. So we had things like that, and that was also part of the sort of student life. In our time at the academy, for the first time, the academy married up with a women's residence in Stellenbosch and linked up with them to participate jointly in the Carnaval, the annual rag. And that became a big thing. I must say it wasn't as appealing to me as it was to the unmarried guys. I mean, for them, it was wonderful to have this, to be linked up with this women's residence and take part in the Carnaval. And it was easy. We had access to things like military trucks and other things to build floats. And so, they had a Smoegtrofee, which was won by the two hostels that worked together. It's always a men's and a women's residence. And these two, there were two that would win the prize for the best float and so on. And whichever women's residence was linked with the academy had a huge advantage. We didn't have the numbers, but we had the resources. And so the academy often won the Smoegtrofee. Athletics was very popular at the academy. So was rugby. I never got involved in the rugby. I'd stopped playing rugby a long time by then. But in the athletics, I used to take part in the tug of war. I was never a great sportsman, but I tried to do my bit and participate. We had adventure training at the academy, and they took us down to the Navy and to the diving school, and the diving instructors chased us around and made us jump off of obstacles and swim forever in the water and things like that. I agitated to become involved based on my experience with the SA Exploration Society, and I took the guys through the Kalk Bay Caves, which is where I used to take the kids through, and as part of the adventure training. And then I helped them to teach the guys abseiling and various rock climbing and things like that. So we had that sort of thing. When we got to our final year, in our second year, we went on a hike through the Cederberg. But some of the senior guys in our group they didn't want to walk, and the instructors didn't make them walk. So it was only about 4 of us that actually went on a real hike through the Cederberg, and it was a wonderful hike. But I felt that when we got to our final year, and they said this period you're going to be doing adventure training. I persuaded the authorities at the academy to let us go down to the Potberg, down near De Hoop, the nature reserve there, and to do a little course with the Cape Department of Nature Conservation, which ended up in all of us qualifying as honorary nature conservation officers. And we had a very interesting time. It was they took us around and showed us the vultures and the various other things that took place in that area. So I felt that was a bit more educational than just, taking the guys on a hike. We had our braais and our parties as a course. We'd get together up on Malgaskop. There were old naval gun emplacements up there that we put in position during the Second World War, and they were standing there deserted, and they were great places to have a braai and a little get together and so on. So we had those sort of things. I got very involved in other aspects of the academy. I became the editor of the student newspaper. It was known as Acadentes, Academie Studentenis. And I edited that for a few years. I spent 2 years on the annual yearbook editorial committee that put together the Academy's annual yearbook. I was in my final year, I was the chairman of the coordinating committee and the liaison committee. Now, the coordinating committee was the group of students who coordinated all student activities. and I was the chairman of that. And then the liaison committee, which I was also chairman of, used to do the liaison between the students and the lecturers and the dean and the commanding officer and so on. So I was involved in the student life over and above my studies, but I didn't get up to the cascanadas that most of the students did. I was beyond that. We did some military training. We did a very interesting exercise with the Navy. They brought submarines and surface craft, and we did it was very good. My good friend Gary Barron, he continued to fly aircraft as often as he could. He was living at Langebaan the Air Force Base, with his wife and his children. And he still flew whenever he got the opportunity. He'd been an instructor there. And he took me up for a flight in the Impala, which was a magnificent experience. I really enjoyed that. And then I had another interesting experience while we were there. I think it was in our second or third year. The Recce's, the Special Forces, established 4 reconnaissance regiment, the Seaborne Regiment at Langebaan. And under command of then Major Malcolm Kinghorn, who also retired to Port Elizabeth and is my nearby neighbor of mine. We see each other frequently. But at that stage, he was way ahead of me as a major. And he was the first commander of 4 Recce, and they got themselves established. They were still busy building the whole setup there. And they arranged for their first jumps at Langebaan. They got a Dakota down and parachutes, and they got all their guys to jump there. And they were looking for extra dispatchers. And when they heard that I was a dispatcher at the academy, they asked me to come and help them. And so I was able to jump with them and to dispatch them. And it was I had some very good jumps with them there. So that was rather pleasant. But then something happened while I was at the academy that I call the Battle of the Beret. I had served until I went to the academy. I'd served only in airborne units. I'd served in 1 Parabon, and then I served in 2 Parabon, and then I went back to 1 Parabon. Now I was at the academy, and I wore the academy, strangely enough, had no issue with my beard. I never said anything about it, and they never said anything about it. So I wore my beard. I kept it neat and well trimmed, and according to the naval regulations. But the beret became an issue, not with the academy, but more with 1 Parabon. The academy came to me and said, "Look, you're no longer with 1 Parachute Battalion, so you now need to wear an infantry beret. You must just wear a green beret." And I said, "No, well, I really think I wouldn't like to have to wear a green beret." So the OC let me know through the military instructor, who was a naval man, said, the OC says you can only wear your red beret if you get permission from the Parachute Battalion. So I wrote a letter to the Parachute Battalion. And as luck would have it, Archie Moore was acting OC at that stage. And when he got my letter, he wrote back to me. And he said, the policy says that if you're transferred out of 1 Parabon, you have to wear the beret of the unit that you're in. And if the unit doesn't have its own beret, then as an infantryman, you wear a green beret. So jy moet maar sterk saam met jou groen beret. So then I started to be devious, you see. I thought, well, I'll write to the OC of 2 Parabon and see if he'll give me permission to wear my maroon beret, my burgundy beret. And so I wrote to him, and his name was Monty Brett at that stage. And He didn't even reply to it. He just sent my letter to one paraben. So when Archie Moore got that letter, he was livid. And he told me, jy sal nie weer jou voet in hierdie eenheid sit nie. You go behind our backs and write to the citizen force commander and think that you're going to get away with it that way. Forget it. You're no longer welcome in this unit. That's it. And that shattered me, because I thought, well, I was hoping to go back to one paraben when I finish at the academy. And it looks like that opportunity is gone now. Anyway, I had to put on a green beret and wear my green beret, much to my disappointment. Not that I had anything against the green beret, but I felt that I'd earned the right to wear the paratrooper beret. But that's what I had to do. So we did have recess training between each year. When you come to the end of the first year, you had about 3 months before the second year started. For those 3 months, you'd have to go off and do an attachment with a unit somewhere. Now, I knew I was unwelcome with one paraben, so there's no way that I could get to one paraben. So I arranged to the first year that we were, my close friend, Jeremy Wiley, who commanded D Company of 2 paraben. I'd been his 2IC when I was in D Company in Cape Town. They were deployed for the Christmas period for a 3-month tour of duty up at Ndangwa. And I managed to get myself attached to them. Even though I was now a PF officer, I was now attached to the CF company, and I deployed with them up at Ndangwa for that recess period. He made me a Hawk Group commander, which is basically a platoon commander. We had what we called a Valkgroepe, and these Hawk groups were 22 men. It was designed to fit into 2 Pumas for Fire Force actions. So I was exposed to the Fire Force concept for the first time. This was late 76, early 77. When Fire Force was just starting to take off in the South African Defence Force. It was well established with the Rhodesians, but it was still a relatively new concept with the South Africans. I also did some long patrols. I remember us going on a 10-day patrol along the Umarumba Odila in Umavambuland. Now, the Odila was often referred to as the Odila Monster, which was a play on the Gila Monster film or whatever it was. We were sent on 10 days patrol through the Odila Umarumba. We never saw any action. We picked up tracks occasionally. We did some follow-ups, but we never saw any action. I was also deployed with my Hawk group down in the area near Umatia and Etosha, where there'd been insurgents that appeared in that area, and we had to patrol that area. And what I remember about those patrols was encountering herds of elephant and them walking through the bush so close to us, you could hardly believe it. And we just sat there frozen while they walked around. The other thing I remember about it was how difficult it was for us to establish communications sometimes. Communications were very difficult while you were on a long patrol through the bush in that part of the world. But that was my first operational experience. As I say, there was no action that we saw. Some of the other platoons that were deployed, they did run into ambushes and they did see action. We didn't, but I was now blooded in the fact, in the sense that I now knew what the operational area was like. I knew what it was like to operate there. I had gone up to join them. I was sent up by train from Cape Town, and I think it was a 3-day trip from Cape Town all the way up through to De Aar and then to Groot, to Windhoek, and ultimately to Grootfontein. And I spent those 3 days on the plane on the train with a counterinsurgency manual, studying that manual, because I hadn't received training as an officer in counterinsurgency operations. So I had to try and learn as much as I could, which I did. And, the deployment went pretty well. Then the second time the second recess period, which is between the second and the third year, I took a chance and I applied to go to 1 Parachute to be detached there. And as luck would have it, Archie Moore had been sent to the battle school, which had been established at Amatia, to take charge of it for a few months. So he was up there running that. And so he didn't see my application. And so it was approved. And I arrived at 1 Parachute with my green beret. And Archie Moore was back by then. And he couldn't just go changing the thing. And he'd just been appointed as the new OC of 1 Parachute. He was to take over as OC on the 1st of January. I arrived there in, I think, November, December. So he was still a major and he was still a 2IC. But I was going to be there during the time that he would take over as OC. And he seemed to have cooled down a bit after the problem, and he saw that I was wearing my green beret, so he wasn't offended. And he sent me to James Hills. And he said, go and join James Hills. He's OC of B Company. They're up at the obstacle course. And I went up to the obstacle course, and I saw all the guys going through the obstacle course at a tremendous rate. And I couldn't see James Hills anywhere. There didn't seem to be any officers anywhere around. There were just guys scrambling through the obstacle course. When they came to the end, they doubled back around and they went through it again. And I stopped one of the guys and I said, Waar's Major Hills? And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, Daar's hy. And he was going through the obstacle course, leopard crawling under the barbed wire with his troops. So I ran over there and I got down and I leopard crawled up next to him. And I said to him, Meneer, Moore het gesê, ek moet by B Company kom aansluit vir die volgende 3 maande. And he didn't stop. As he was crawling through, he said, Bakgat McGill, kom, dis wat tel hierdie goed. Kom, bly by ons. And I had to keep up with him. Before tea time that day, I'd been through the obstacle course 3 times. I'd run 2 2,4s. And I was just about exhausted. But I spent those next 3 months with B Company, little knowing that in less than a year I would take over command of that company. But I was now appointed as his 2IC. His actual 2IC was on course, and when he came back from course, he was going on leave. So James was looking for a 2IC at that stage, and I filled in for that. And in those 3 months, I learned so much from James Hills. His approach to training was so different from anyone else that I'd ever seen. He did everything with his troops, everything. And he was fitter than any of them. And if he said we're running a 2,4, he'd run 2. And he'd usually come in ahead of everybody, most of them anyway. And he was constantly getting his troops to run. Wherever they'd go, they'd have to run. And every spare chance that he got, he'd take them to the shooting range, and they'd have to shoot. He was just such a fiery, burning officer who he just wanted, and his word all the time to his troops, all the time. It was skuimbolle, man, skuimbolle. That's the only thing that mattered, you know. He wanted to see the sweat coming through their mouths as they were doing. They had to really show. They had to be like a panting racehorse. I really enjoyed working with him. It was wonderful, and he used me very well. He utilized me all the time, and he would give me guidance as to how to do things. And at the end of my 3 months, when I went to the new commanding officer, who was Archie Moore, and I went through to his office to say, Major, commandant, ek kom net sê tot ziens, ek gaan nou terug akademie toe. And he looked at me and he said, McGill, dankie vir wat jy gedoen het. Jy het goed gedoen hierso. Ek wil net vir jou sê, jy is welkom om weer terug te kom hierdie eenheid toe as jy klaar is by die akademie. en jy mag maar jou rooi beret dra. Ja, I nearly fell on my back, you know. But I'd worked hard. Those 3 months that I'd worked really hard there to try and make up for the fact that I was now the bad guy because I was at the academy. So that was my time with there was one other thing that happened right at the beginning of when Archie Moore now knew that I was at the unit. Ewart Olkers had approved me coming to the unit for 3 months. Archie Moore was going to be taking over in a month or two, but here I was with my green beret, trying to be respectful and not offend anybody and so on, but I was still wearing my beard. And I come onto the parade ground, and Archie Moore is there. And he looks at me and he says, "Lieutenant." So I said, "Jammer." He looks at me and he says, "Wanneer skeer jy daai baard af?" So I looked at him and I knew this is the guy who's going to become OC of the battalion. It's no good me getting bolshy with him now. So I said to him, "Ek sal dit dadelik doen, commandant, 8 major." So he said, "No, toe, weg is jy." So I ran back to the mess and I shaved off my beard and I came back. And that was it. For the next 9 years, I didn't have a beard. There's a story about when I got my beard back, but that we'll talk about it another occasion. So the battle of the beret was one, but the battle of the beard was another one. After that I was clean shaven, except for a moustache. I kept my moustache. Then just something I must say about my family life when it comes to the academy. Anne had been told, because of the ruptured uterus, she'd been told that she cannot have any more children. Now we only had Melanie, our second little girl. And Anne was very upset about this. They said it's too dangerous. Your uterus ruptures again, we could lose you. So we tried to adopt, and we had a heck of a battle. We couldn't adopt anyone because they said, "You've already got a child. People are wanting children who don't have children. We've got to give them priority." So all our efforts, and you know, we had all sorts of other things. So people would say to some of the places we went to, they would say to us, "Ja, maar julle is nie NG nie. Ons kinders is almal NG wat na ons toe kom, en ons plaas net kinders met NG families." So, you know, if that's their view, then you're not going to get a child. So we had all sorts of problems with trying to adopt. But then Anne was constantly going to the gynecologist to try and persuade them to let her fall pregnant again. And eventually they said, "Okay, you can fall pregnant again, but for the last 3 months of your pregnancy, you're going to have to be in hospital where we can monitor you every day." So she said, "Fine." And so in my second year at the academy, she fell pregnant. And while I was up in Bloemfontein with doing my recess training with one paraben, she was in hospital. And the baby was born, another little girl, Shona, and she was perfect. So now we had 2 children. But of course, as I say, Anne had to spend 3 months in hospital before the little one was born. We also found that at the end of our second year on the Kop, we were informed that some houses had become available for military in Vredenburg. And so those of us who were still on the Kop were moved into the houses in Vredenburg. So we got a very nice house in Vredenburg. And for my final year in at the academy, we lived in Vredenburg, and I used to cycle from our house, from Vredenburg to Saldanha, and then attend classes, and in the afternoons I would cycle back. So we had 2 years on the Kop and 1 year in Vredenburg. And then towards the end of the year in Vredenburg, we had the farewell ball and the passing out parade. And because I was chairman of the coordinating committee, I persuaded the other guys that we needed to have a pipe band for our passing out parade. And the other guys thought it was a good idea. So I was also chairman of the liaison committee, so I had to deal with the dean and the OC. And I had a slightly more difficult job persuading them, but they eventually agreed to it too. So we had the Cape Town Highlanders pipes and drums for our passing out parade. I think it was the first time that a pipe band was used for the military academy for their passing out parade. But it was great, and I really enjoyed that. And then I had to head for back to 1 Paraben and start my serious soldiering. And that was a busy time. And I'm wondering, Chris, maybe we should discuss that at the next conversation. And I'm not going to get through the whole of that first decade this time, because my military involvement during the rest of that decade was incredible. It was unbelievable, the things that happened. So maybe we should just end with my having finished up at the academy. And next time I'll talk about what it was like to be at 1 Paraben after the military academy.
I would love to hear that, sir. Thank you. I have a few questions as always, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course, no problem.
Just for people who perhaps doesn't know, sir, we get people from all over the world now watching. They don't always understand the South African military. If there's 2 officers standing next to each other, and one is citizen force and the other one is permanent force, would it be possible for someone to figure that one out based upon the uniform? Does the citizen guy have a different uniform? Does he look different?
Of course, it really depends on the unit. The traditional units, the old units, like the Cape Field Artillery, the Natal Carbineers, 2 of the oldest units in the citizen force, the Cape Town Highlanders, the Transvaal Scottish, the First City, the Witwatersrand Rifles, the Rand Light Infantry. Those are all traditional units, and because they're old, most of them are I think they've all had name changes now, so technically those units don't really exist anymore. But most of them, even back in those days, in the 1970s, were 100 years old or close to it, and some of them are quite a bit older. I think the Cape Field Artillery was about 120 years old at that stage. So these are old units, old regiments with a long tradition and with a very particular uniform. There was an attempt in the early 60s to do away with these uniforms, the traditional uniforms, and put everybody in the same uniform because it was felt they were un-South African. They were too British. With the traditional units, to this day, they still carry swords. They wear Sam Browns. They have what many people regard as strange headgear. And of course, the Highland regiments wear kilts. The Lowland regiments wear trews. A unit like the Rand Light Infantry, their ceremonial dress is short pants with a tunic. It's a different uniform. They have different uniform, and largely those regiments were the taxpayer didn't cover the cost of those uniforms. The regiments themselves had to find the money to pay for those uniforms. But the majority of citizen force units were not traditional units. They were units that had been established much later, many of them post-Second World War. And those units had their uniform didn't really differ much from the uniform worn by the permanent force guys. So the only way you would tell the difference there was to look at the unit insignia, the shoulder flash, and many of them had their own particular beret badge and collar dogs. So from that, you could see that this is a citizen force guy. But the other aspects, the tunic that they wore, the trousers that they wore, the shoes that they wore, the beret that they wore, was just the same as the permanent force. So, as I say, it depends on the unit. Some units were blatantly and glaringly different from the permanent force. Other units, except for smallish insignia, it was the same uniform that the permanent force wore.
They were all fine fighting units, which you just mentioned now. Rank Light Infantry, the Scots, and whatever unit they are. They did very well at the border war. They were doing their bit.
I think that it was an eye-opener for many permanent force officers when the war intensified. Prior to 1975, to Operation Savannah, the citizen force were not really deployed operationally, not in what was then Southwest Africa. It was very rare to encounter citizen force units up there or elements up there. You would often get, I know the paratroopers used to, as individuals, they would volunteer for border service, and then they would be attached to a parachute company or another company up there. But for units themselves to be deployed, that didn't really happen much. But after, in fact, during Savannah, when it was realized that we're now involved in a war, it's no longer a low intensity war, and this war, we need manpower for a war. And where are we going to get that? Well, the manpower in the old SADF lay mainly with the citizen force. The citizen force was by far the largest manpower component of the army anyway. So citizen force units, they started to mobilize them. And legislation was passed so that they could be called up for up to 90 days, which is basically 3 months. And then they started calling them up and deploying them, and not just deploying them, elements of them, but taking a whole battalion or a whole regiment and deploying that whole regiment up there. And there was quite a lot of nervousness amongst many of the permanent force guys, because these guys are weekend soldiers. They're really just playing at soldiers. Are they going to actually fight a war now? And I think it was quite a sobering experience for the guys when they realized that these guys who they'd been trying to do away with their uniforms, they'd been trying to make them conform to what the permanent force were in terms of appearances and so on. And here these guys get called up, and they've got properly functioning headquarters, and they've got guys who are dead keen to go up and do their work and to participate. There've been a lot of it's become fashionable to write books about the evils of conscription and about how what a disruptive thing it was for the people, and how negative an influence it was, and how the people hated it to have to go and do border duty and so on. There's no doubt that there were people who were like that. But, there are books that have been written in which they try to, the authors selectively choose people who have got some sort of grudge against the old SADF. And so they want to portray their national service as something very, very negative, and their citizen force service. And so they'll select these guys and put them into a book, and then it looks like everybody was like that. That wasn't the case. There were a lot of citizen force guys who couldn't wait to go. They were extremely excited when they were called up for the first time. And they were sent to places like De Brugge outside Bloemfontein, where they were issued with the latest equipment, and they were given some rudimentary training, and then they were sent off and had to be deployed. Later, the training was given in the retraining was given up at places like Oshivelo, Omotia, those places, and then they were deployed in the area. Oshivelo was a very good place to acclimatize. and the training school, the battle school that was set up there, was very effective and very good for getting the guys ready for the actual deployments. And when they were deployed, they did very well. They really did. And the surprising thing for many people was that the traditional regiments were more parat, more prepared than a lot of the other regiments. They were guys who had a history going back to the Second World War, and in some cases the First World War, and in some cases the Anglo-Boer War, and they were proud of their history, and they wanted their units to rise to this occasion as well, and to do the job properly. And for the most part, they really did. And there were a lot of the other regiments too. There was Regiment Skoonspruit and Regiment President Steyn, and Regiment Bloemspruit, and these sort of things. I mean, President Steyn and Regiment Groot Karoo, Groot Karoo's predecessor, the Middellandse Regiment, had a fine Second World War record. President Steyn had a Second World War record. So you had Afrikaans regiments that also had a tradition of military service that they wanted this to continue, and they went out of their way to make sure that their units were up to scratch and could come to the party. So I think that after Savannah and during the period when units were called up for 90 days, a lot of permanent force guys' eyes opened quite wide when they saw what the capabilities of these units were. Not just their capabilities, but their enthusiasm. They really wanted to. The Cape Town Islanders, when they left Cape Town for their first 90-day trip, it was like when the guys went up north for the Second World War. There were people on the train stations and the platforms, and they were waving them goodbye, and the guys had made banners and they'd written on chalk on the sides of the railways, the coaches, and they were leaning out and waving at the guys, and every guys were wishing them luck and give them blazes and so on. And when they were up there, they would have their pipers would play, and they maintained their traditions. All the traditional units, when they went up there, they had their officers' mess and their NCO's mess, and the traditions that took place in those messes and the formalities. They adhered to all of that sort of thing, and I found that wonderful to see, to observe that sort of thing, because I had a soft spot in my heart for the traditional aspects and the traditional units, and it was good to see how well they did the job. And some of them got highly commended. I mean, the RLI, the Rand Light Infantry, the commendations they got from their deployments, and they got the sort of comments that were, you're one of the best units that has ever deployed here. You've done a fine job. So they proved that the concept of a citizen force that can be activated and then trained in a relatively short period, because they're all already trained, they just have to be refreshed, can be deployed, and very effectively. There were some that were not so successful. There were some that were problematic, but the majority did exceptionally well. And as that period went on, that they continued for the next 15 years or so, being called up for 90 days at a time. It would put a strain on the economy. It put a strain on the personal lives of many people. But the capabilities of the units increased phenomenally. And I think one needs to give them credit for that. One needs to acknowledge that. And sometimes it was, and it wasn't the fault of the units that there were problems, but sometimes there were problems when it came to the more complicated operations. It's difficult when a citizen force unit is mobilized and has to form a battle group together with some artillery and some armor and so on, and then be used. It's very difficult for them to achieve the same level of expertise and of skill and of competence that a unit like 6-1 mechanized battalion group would have, because 6-1 was a permanent fixture. They were on the go all the time. It wasn't just 90 days for them. It was permanent. They were there all the time, and they were being used all the time. And subunits might change within the battle group, but the battle group's procedures were laid down. The way things happened was laid down. Their commanders, 6-1 particularly, but some of the others as well, 6-1 had exceptionally gifted and competent mechanized infantry commanders who had come through the whole process, the nurturing and the developing and the implementation of mechanized operations and mechanized infantry. People like Roland de Vries and Eb van Lille and at later stage Bok Smit and other people like that, Gerard Low. These were very competent people. Johan Dippenaar. These were exceptional, highly professional people who'd spent their whole lives soldiering. So it's a little difficult and a little unfair to want to compare 6-1 mechanized battalion group to a hastily composed battle group that is put together, that is consisting of citizen force soldiers who've just come in and had some rush training, and now they get deployed. Obviously, it's going to take a while for them to really get into the momentum of things. But the fact is that when the button was pushed, the citizen force came to the party, and they did so very competently.
I have to agree with you, sir. In the 1990s, a lot of books came out which were extremely negative. And as you say, they were selected. I actually threw one away. It's the only book ever in my life I threw away. So I love books. But that one was so obviously written with a political agenda that I just couldn't read it. I thought it was unfair. And I don't think that the war was unpopular anymore. Most of the people of my age, we actually liked the idea of going to the borders. The great adventure, and we were winning. That's the other thing. We were winning that fight. But now I need to ask you, sir, what is the fire force concept? Because that's probably the greatest thing which came from the Rhodesian Bush War and then was taken over by the South Africans later on. There might be some people here who doesn't understand the concept. And I know this is a PhD thesis on its own. But perhaps if you can just tell us, because it is part of an airborne concept, isn't it, in a greater sense of the word?
Of course, you're right, it is. It's certainly an airborne concept. The Rhodesians honed it to a particularly high level of expertise. It was a very competent tool for them to use in their campaign in the greater 30-year war, because we were all involved in a sense in the same war, the Portuguese, the Rhodesians, and the South Africans. And the enemy that we were fighting against were all allied. And they all had the same objective in mind on both sides. So it was really, and historians increasingly speak about the Southern African 30-year war, which includes all three of those, and that there was the Rhodesian campaign, there was the Angolan campaign, there was the Mozambique campaign, and there was the Namibian campaign. And to a certain extent, you could say there was a South African campaign as well, but that was not so much an actual war in the sense that it was in the other places, a conventional type, bordering on conventional type of war. The fire force had its origins with the Portuguese, and few people appreciate that. It was coincidental, but it was very significant that the Portuguese and the Rhodesians and the South Africans all selected and used the Alouette 3 helicopter. It's not so strange that it happened with the Portuguese, because they worked very closely with the French, particularly studying the French operations in Algeria in the late 50s and early 60s. And the development of the Alouette came out of that conflict. And so the Portuguese, many of whom were on attachment with the French during the Algerian conflict, it was almost natural that they would take over the French idea of the Alouette. I've never been able to figure out why the Rhodesians selected the Alouette. They were prior to UDI, and that's when they got the Alouette. They had access to British things. And the fact that they never adopted a British helicopter always seemed strange to me. But for whatever reason, they did. They adopted the Alouette. It might have had something to do with the fact that they were already realizing that they were going to be cutting their ties with Britain, that the conflict was looming, the altercation between the two countries, and that they were watching what South Africa was doing. Because the South Africans were looking around as well. And there was competition between the Americans and the French to sell us helicopters. And the Americans tried very hard to do that. But wisely, the South Africans saw that they could see what was going to happen with sanctions, and as these things were building up. And if they bought the American, I think it was the Husky was the name of the helicopter that the Americans had at that stage, which was a good helicopter. Our military attaché in Washington had spent time on the helicopter and flying in the helicopter, and had sent very positive reports about the helicopter. But the South Africans realized that America is going to turn on the screws, cut the supplies. We're going to run into problems with that. So they looked at the French one, and the French Alouette at that stage was one of the finest helicopters in the world in the early 60s. The Alouette 2, first of all, had been a sort of a pioneering version, and then they graduated to the 3, and it was a phenomenal little helicopter. Be that as it may, all 3 of those countries had the Alouette 3, the Portuguese, the Rhodesians, and the South Africans. The Portuguese were the first ones to fit a 20mm cannon to the side door of the Alouette. And the Portuguese had strike forces that they deployed by helicopter, mainly to protect convoys in Angola, in the northern part of Angola. If that convoy ran into a contact, then these strike forces would be activated, and they would be positioned somewhere along the route that the convoy was taking, and then they would fly in and intercept these guys. But it wasn't a highly organized sort of thing. It wasn't, the techniques weren't very well worked out. They had these gunships that were firing through a side door with a 20mm cannon and high explosive. And they were able to position a few troops because the Alouette had a very limited passenger capability. But they had something there. By the time the Rhodesians started operating, the Rhodesians initially worked quite closely with the Portuguese, both in Angola and Mozambique, but especially in Mozambique. And they picked up the whole concept of the armed Alouette and were very quick to introduce it in Rhodesia. There were different guns that were used. At one stage, they used to use a 20mm cannon that was fitted to the Vampire aircraft, which was apparently quite good. And there were various others that they looked at too. But the Rhodesians developed the concept, and they would have a gunship, which they called a K-car, which is essentially the killing car. This was the ship that the gunship that did the killing. And then they had a G-car, which was a more general purpose. It had a very light machine gun that was fitted in the door, and it could carry passengers, maybe 4 troops. So they could put down sticks of 4 with these G-cars, and they had a K-car, which, because it was carrying a heavy gun, a 20 millimeter with heavy ammunition, and they'd put the ground commander in that car, and no troops. So essentially, the fire force concept that developed entailed activating a quick strike force to go in and intercept any insurgents that were identified, any group of insurgents that were identified. And the way they identified them, the terrain in Rhodesia, particularly in the eastern part of Rhodesia, there were many little hills. A lot of it was thick bush, but there were many little hills. And these hills were referred to as gomas. And the gomas were used to position observation posts. And these observation posts were manned often by the RAR, the Rhodesian African Rifles, but also by others, sometimes Selous Scouts, sometimes even the SAS and the RLI. There were all sorts who provided these OPs, observation posts. And the RAR were particularly good at this. And from the top of these little hills, they could dominate an area, and they could see what was happening in that area. And in the spaces between the trees and so on, they would see insurgents because they had intelligence as to where the insurgents were likely to come from. And they would deploy OPs in that area. And when the OPs saw the insurgents moving between the bushes and the trees, then they would activate, they'd send the message by radio to the fire force, which would be positioned on an airfield fairly close by, within the area where they expected the insurgents to be. Obviously, you want the flying time from the base that you take off, the fire force base, to where you're going to have your action to be as short a time as possible. So they would activate this force, and the force would take off with the helicopters. And the commander, usually a company commander, sometimes a company 2IC, would be sitting in the K-car and would fly to the area. And whereas the G-cars would fly in low to deliver the troops on the ground, the K-car would circle above the area because the OPs would be able to give a grid reference of exactly where they picked these guys up. They would circle around there, and then the commander would give instructions from his helicopters to the other helicopters where he wants these troops positioned on the ground. And these 4-man groups would be positioned, and they would try to box in the terrorists, or insurgents is the term that is more generally used and probably more accurate. And they'd box in the insurgents and then gradually close on them. And the cars would be circling, and the K-car would circle. And the K-car, with its heavy 20 millimeter gun, automatic cannon, as soon as it spotted the guys, would open up on them. And it decimated them. But the war in Rhodesia, the numbers of insurgents and the insertion of insurgents into Rhodesia grew to such an extent. And the G-cars were just so small, you couldn't get enough troops on the ground. There weren't enough helicopters anyway. South Africa was providing helicopters to assist with this, but there still weren't enough helicopters for all the fire forces that were positioned. There were sometimes 2 or 3 or even 4 fire forces in different parts of Rhodesia, and you'd have to divide your helicopters up amongst them. And helicopters, had a limited flying time. Some they'd have to be serviced and they'd have to be repaired and so on. So there was always a shortage of helicopters. So the Rhodesians developed a very clever system to make this work better. They started using paratroopers as well. They got the Dakotas, and they would put 20 paratroopers in the Dakotas, divide them up into 4-man sticks, and then they would the Dakota would take off and follow go to the same area that the helicopters had gone to. The helicopters could position people, but the commander in the air would see where the insurgents are heading for, and he'd realize he needs another stop group in a different place. So he would just drop a smoke grenade to indicate where he wants them dropped, and the Dakota would fly in and drop the paratroopers. And as the concept was honed and became better and more smoothly operational, it wouldn't even be necessary to drop a smoke grenade. He could say where he wants them and describe it, and the pilots worked so closely with the ground commanders that they positioned them very, very accurately. And then the helicopters, the G-cars, would be used to reposition people on the ground. Of course, you constantly had the problem of fuel and running out of fuel for the helicopters. So the fire force would have a tail, a ground tail, that when the fire force was activated and sent out to carry out this airborne operation by helicopter and by parachute, the ground tail would also leave the base and would go by land to as close as it could to where the action was. So the helicopters didn't have to fly all the way back to the base to refuel. They could just fly to where the ground tail was and quickly refuel there and get back into the action. And if there was a second K car available, the ground commander could transfer to the other K car while his K car went to go and refuel. So there were all sorts of permutations and modifications that could be made to make the fire force work. And the Rhodesian fire force commanders became exceptionally good at this particular technique. They really ran it very well. And the Rhodesians coined the term fire force. And the Rhodesians, the big difference between the way the South Africans ran it and the way the Rhodesians ran it was partly determined by terrain, but it was also determined by a different attitude. And I've never been able to quite work out why we held on to the attitude that we did. The Rhodesians had a very mobile concept. Their thinking was very mobile. Their fire forces were not bound to a particular base. They moved to where the action was. And they'd identified little dirt airstrips all over Rhodesia. And they knew where these were, and they just moved their fire force to the closest airstrip to where the action was. And if their intelligence told them that there was going to be insurgent activity in a particular area, they could move the fire force as close as possible to that. And they could activate it in a very short time because there were short distances they had to fly. They could be there in next to no time. The level of cooperation between the Rhodesians, between the Air Force and the Army, was exceptionally high. They worked like an absolute team. It was very possible because it was a small defense force, a small armed forces, and they all knew one another personally, and they were able to run it as a as a team, and have practiced and a very good team. And the South Africans, particularly the Air Force, the pilots, the chopper pilots, they picked up tremendous experience in fire force operations in Rhodesia, because they were deployed in Rhodesia for a long, long time, for a lot of that war. They would go over as Rhodesians, and their helicopters would be marked as Rhodesian helicopters and painted the same color as and camouflage as the Rhodesian ones, and they'd all wear Rhodesian camouflage. And so they didn't go through as South Africans, they went through as Rhodesians. Although I don't think anybody was fooled by that. I think everybody knew they were South Africans and who the South Africans were. But in any case, we weren't officially supporting the Rhodesians, but in fact, that's exactly what we were doing. The South Africans tended to, with our fire force, we had one fire force permanently stationed at Ondangwa, and it tended to operate from Ondangwa. And often the insurgent activity would be very far away. And it would take quite a while for the fire force to get from Ondangwa to where the contact had taken place. And often by the time they got there, the insurgents were gone. So the fire force action would turn into a follow-up action, and the troops would be put on the ground, find the square, and start tracking. And they would chase after the insurgents. And then if they bumped into them, then they'd call in the choppers again to assist them. So it was largely a reactive manner in which the South Africans used the fire force. They waited for something to happen. The Rhodesians looked for where the problem was and they placed their fire force. They moved their fire force to where they wanted to. So their thinking was far more mobile than the South African thinking, particularly in the early phases of the fire force concept in South Africa. We did become more mobile in our thinking, particularly when the insurgents crossed right through Ovamboland and went into the so-called white farmland where all the white farmers used to live. In other words, south of the red line, the Beck and Close here, the mouth and foot disease line, which was the red line. South of that red line, where the farmers were, the white farmers, when the insurgents moved into that area, we would move our fire force. Sometimes we had enough helicopters to even establish a second fire force and move it down into that area. And often we would move from farm to farm. Because we had Pumas, we could move a lot more troops by helicopter. So we didn't need to use the Dakotas to drop the troops. We could move enough troops if we had 2 or 3 or more Pumas. And the fire force was very competently and well utilized, and in a very mobile manner was utilized south of the red line in those areas, Otavi, Otjiwarongo, Tsumeb, those sort of areas. So there was a different approach there. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that often 6-1 Mechanized Battalion Group was deployed on those operations, and 6-1 Mechanized Battalion Group had a mobile approach to warfare. They had a very they weren't interested in attrition warfare, in positional warfare. They were constantly changing their positions. Unfortunately, in Sector 10, that didn't happen very much, but there were reasons for this. Geography played a big role. We didn't have copies. We didn't have gomas where we could position OPs. Our people would have to rely on a contact. And when there was a contact between security forces and the insurgents, then the call would go out for the fire force and the fire force would go in and join the contact. So that's the first way that made it very different. Ovamboland, as you know, and everyone who's been up there will know, is flat. You can sit with a 1 in 50,000 map that will have not one single contour line on it. None. Because there's no fall in the land. It's all flat. It's all flat. The nearest contour line is on the next map over here and on the next map over here, but the map that you happen to have doesn't have any contour lines on it because the ground is all level. So there was no way you could position people to actually, as OPs, to find the insurgents. But also we didn't have the same degree of intelligence that the Rhodesians did. The Rhodesians, particularly with the Selous Scouts, where they were able to carry out their pseudo operations and actually infiltrate the insurgent ranks. They were able to provide the security forces with excellent intelligence. We didn't really have that. Jan Breitenbach tried very hard to do that with 32 Battalion. And he had some success with that. But it was a concept that didn't really gain popularity in the higher echelons of the SADF. So we didn't really apply it in the way that the Rhodesians did. Of course, the Rhodesians had far more insurgents. Because there were so many insurgents, it was much easier to actually infiltrate the insurgents the way the Selous Scouts did than it was in Ovamboland. So there were differences and there were reasons. And of course, Ovamboland was a bit different from the tribal trust lands in Rhodesia. And the people who were in Ovamboland, many of them were not, they weren't prepared to provide the security forces with the information, the intelligence that they were looking for. So it was a little different. But the fire force concept was later developed by the South Africans and became far more sophisticated. You know, the problem with your Alouette was that it didn't have a night flying capability. If you didn't have enough light to see the area around you and to spot the trees and the power lines and various other things, it was dangerous to fly in the Alouette at night. The Puma could fly at night. That was a big difference. The Puma was also much faster than the Alouette, so that played a big role. And what the South Africans did was they developed two variations of the fire force concept. The one was called a rubber duck or bakkie ops, where they would actually take a vehicle, a civilian vehicle, loaded with troops and arms, and go out into the area where they knew insurgents were. And this vehicle would be fairly well armor protected and try and goad the insurgents into ambushing them. And in the meantime, they would put a fire force in the air. Now, the Puma had a far longer holding time than the Alouette, so it could stay airborne longer. The Dakota was the big difference. So the Dakota could stay in the air for a long, long time. So you'd put a Dakota load of troops in the air and fly them around over there. And then you could launch your attack the moment that bakkie was, that decoy had elicited a response from the insurgents. You could bring down your Puma. The problem was that your fire force commander couldn't sit in the gunship because it eventually ran out of fuel. So often your commander would have to sit in a fixed wing aircraft like a Bosbok or a Kudu, which was basically a light reconnaissance aircraft, and sit up there and be able to spend a few hours up in the air and be called in when necessary. But the more successful of the sophisticated versions that the South Africans developed, and both of these were far more mobile in concept than the traditional fire force. The more successful one was what they called lunar ops. And it was called lunar ops because you could only really do it when there was sufficient moonlight. For about half of a month, you could carry out lunar operations. And with lunar ops, you'd put your fire force in the Dakotas, in the air, and you'd work on the basis of the curfew, because there was a curfew in Ovamboland. And if you, the commander in the light fixed wing aircraft spotted the headlights of a car down below after the curfew, then he'd call in the fire force, and they would jump, they would parachute at night around this vehicle that has been identified and stop it, block it off. And if it was insurgents, it would turn into a firefight. But if it wasn't, they would stop it and they would search it. And maybe it's just a guy who's breaking the curfew. He wants to go and visit his girlfriend or whatever the reason. But if it was insurgents, it would invariably turn into a firefight. And they had quite a number of successes with lunar operations. So that's in brief, course, that's Fire Force. You know, the detail one could go into and talk for hours on it. And we actually, a couple of the officers from one paraben, Major Anton van Graan and Captain Fred Burger, were attached to Rhodesian Fire Forces for about 5 weeks. And they participated in Fire Force actions with the Rhodesians, not only with the commander, but they actually went in as troops and jumped with them and landed by helicopter with them, both in Rhodesia and in Mozambique. And they participated in actions with them to quite an extent, came back with their reports, and a lot of what they learned over there was then introduced into one paraben's training, and the way one paraben would run Fire Forces. Anton van Graan was then transferred to 44 Para Brigade when they'd been established as Jan Breitenbach's sidekick, and he was able to introduce a lot of those Fire Force techniques into the citizen force as well, from 2 and 3 Parachute Battalion. And then towards the end of the Rhodesian War, South African companies were actually deployed inside Rhodesia as Fire Forces. And eventually there were 2 Fire Forces in the south of Rhodesia that were completely manned by South Africans. They had been trained initially by the Rhodesians and prepared for these operations, and then they were placed in position, and they carried out with South African helicopters and South African Dakotas, but they didn't use the Dakota very much because the Pumas made it unnecessary. They could put enough people down with a Puma, and the Puma was far more versatile than the Dakota. So the South Africans did pick up a lot of good experience and learn a great deal about running Fire Forces in Rhodesia from the Rhodesians, and through participation in the Rhodesian War. Again, they went over as Rhodesians, wearing Rhodesian camouflage and you know, pretending to be Rhodesians. But again, I don't think they fooled anybody. But they didn't fool the insurgents, and they didn't fool the Rhodesian farmers. I don't know who they were supposed to fool. I know that even when they're leading up to after the Lancaster talks and leading up to the ceasefire and the deployment of the British military assistance team over there, the Brits all knew that these were South Africans that were being deployed there. So, you know, it was a bit of a joke, but ostensibly we were not involved in Rhodesia. But the paratroopers were, for about 6 months, we ran Fire Forces. Companies, even the citizen force guys were sent over and did Fire Force. The citizen force guys would go for 4 weeks. The permanent force or national service companies would go for 6 weeks, and they would relieve one another. And Fire Force X-Ray and Fire Force Yankee, they were South African Fire Forces. So that's in brief the Fire Force. As I say, I could talk for much longer about it. And if you got to any of the Rhodesian guys who did this sort of thing, they'd talk to you for hours on it, because they were really very good at this Fire Force.
Yes, thank you for that, sir. I think in the future we will have an episode, if you don't mind, on air assault, which I think is a term which the American viewers will probably understand more.
Yeah.
But what he said to me, very, very sad, is when the US got itself involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, they wrote a new counterinsurgency manual. And I studied this manual. I wanted to see what's inside it. And there were nothing of South Africa or Rhodesia.
Yeah.
Nothing. So they've learned nothing. They went back to the UK, where their last experience was something like 1960. They never benefited by this.
Yeah.
And that I can talk about for many hours, because a lot of them died, because they didn't bother to listen to what we could tell them. But now, sir, really one last question. You know, when you were living there at Malgaskop, there at the military academy in the old bungalows.
Yes.
You had like a small child with you there. And in those days, there were no real nappies and things. You changed them with material. How did you do the washing, sir? How did your wife, how did she cope to do the washing? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a problem, particularly because we had a little girl who was still in nappies, and several of the other guys there also had young children about the age of our little girl. So there were lots of nappies to be washed, and you didn't have disposable nappies in those days. So, you had to wash the nappies. Of course, I've still got a tin bath. We bought it when we were living on the Kop. And not only did Anne do the washing by hand in that tin bath, she had to use the tin bath as a bath as well, because she didn't like showering. She wanted to bath. So she had to sit in this tin bath, and that's where she had to bath. Until I managed to scrounge a proper enamel full-size bath somewhere and put it up. But washing was a problem. There was electricity up there, and we were able to eventually get the stuff set up in such a way that we could use our washing machine. But of course, we couldn't keep it in our bungalow. It would have to be in the communal bathroom. So there were some minor sort of issues about people using one another's washing machines and so on. But we were ways that we could get around it, and the academy was very accommodating in trying to allow us to do things that they might not otherwise have allowed students to do. Those communal bathrooms that we had were a bit of a nightmare, because you couldn't go and shower anytime you wanted to. You had to wait for your block time. And during the day, the wives, they sorted out when to do the washing and so on. So we did manage to find a way to make it work.
I can just say, sir, you had a fantastic wife. You still do. That's amazing. But you know what? There's a saying, I've heard about it, that they say that India was actually tamed by the Mem Sahibs, by the women folk of the British soldiers.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a lot of similarity here, which I can see
Yes.
from the historical movement.
I'd never thought of that, but you're probably right.
Yeah, they came out during the mutiny, I believe. When was it? 1857, 56.
Yeah.
About there, where they really made a stand. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we think as Afrikaners were voortrekker women, of course, your 1820 settler women. No, so they made the impression. We should honor them. We should honor them. Well, Internet, we've come to an end of a fascinating episode again. Sir, I have to tell you, I enjoy this tremendously. Thank you for coming. Thank you for speaking to us. I'm looking forward to the next one. And I'm sure so is everybody else watching here. So until we meet again, God bless.